Hello and welcome to Conscious TV. My name is Ian McNay and today we're going to talk about ME, that's chronic fatigue syndrome, and we're going to have an overview of the subject by Alex Howard. Hi Alex.
Hi Ian.
Now Alex actually had ME when he was 15 years old and he had ME quite badly for nearly 7 years, and he actually did write a book about his account of his experiences of how he got ME, how he dealt with it, and actually in the end how he recovered from ME. So Alex, let's just move on to the overview. And one thing I liked also was that in a report you did called ME in the 21st Century, you are no longer a mystery. And I think that's what many people with ME think. They actually think they're a mysterious case and doctors can't actually do anything to cure them. And that's obviously not true.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I had ME myself for 7 years. And that was back in the mid-90s when I first got diagnosed. And back at that point, you'd go to your doctor and, I had tiredness and dizziness and those kind of symptoms. And there was really no answer. And I went down a path of trying a number of different alternative therapies and nutrition-based therapies and really just doing everything I could to try and turn around what was obviously a very difficult situation. And as we talked about in an interview that we did for Conscious TV quite recently, that I spent the first 2 years virtually bedbound, hardly able to really do anything. And I really got to the point that I just could not continue with life being that way. And I got to the point that really I saw that my life was going to go in one of two directions. I was going to kind of either continue with this kind of waiting for somebody else to find an answer and wait for the medical system to have some kind of answers, or I was going to have to do something more proactive myself to turn that situation around. And what really started out as a kind of desperate search for myself went on to become what eventually became a clinic that now works with quite a number of people. And even now, I think a lot of people diagnosed with ME or chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia as a whole kind of group of illnesses that maybe we'll talk a bit about in this interview, that one of the really difficult things is you may have that label, but it doesn't really tell you what's actually wrong with you. And that was very difficult, especially for me in those quite early days of what an illness affects a lot more people now, that you have this label, but it doesn't actually tell you what's actually going on inside of your body.
Okay, so somebody doesn't feel well and it's an ongoing situation, they go to the doctor and the doctor says, you've got ME.
Right.
So where do they go from there?
Well, there are treatments that are kind of available on the NHS in the UK, and in America there are kind of similar things that are available, but they really involve managing symptoms rather than actually understanding the underlying things that are going on.
And the symptoms, so we're clear, the person is usually very tired, can have achy body, not much motivation in life.
This in of itself brings up the whole kind of big challenge of this area is the symptoms are different in different people.
Okay.
Some people have just fatigue, so they don't really have much apart from that, but they're just really struggling to keep up with a day-to-day life. That's kind of at one level. At the other extreme, you have people which have fatigue, but also can have headaches, dizziness, light and sound sensitivity, muscle pains, a whole range of other things that can be going on. And it can range from people which are literally in a darkened room that they're so ill they're unable to do anything, even get out of bed, to people which can pretty much keep up with life, but there's not the energy that should really be there. And they're more susceptible to either viruses or colds, and they just kind of get knocked out more than kind of other people would. So you've got a whole range of different people with different symptoms and different expressions of what's going on. And a Western model of needing or wanting to classify people into one group with one list of symptoms to then go and look for one treatment that's going to work for all of those people. And one of the things that we say at the clinic is that ME is not an illness in the traditional sense. It's really a process of a number of things in the body that have gone out of balance. And one of the keys really to understanding it is that where a specific person is at, what's happening for them so they can be treated individually.
So it's interesting you say that things have gone out of balance in the body. What do you mean by that?
Well, the body's got a whole bunch of different parts of it, from the immune system to the digestive system to the endocrine system. And as I was kind of saying, in the medical model, it's always looking for one thing that you can give a drug or a treatment for. And in the way that we work with ME and also other kind of specialist clinics that are out there, they're looking at also different stages with the illness. We look at certain predisposing factors, so things that could be going on prior to becoming ill that can predispose someone towards something like ME.
So what's an example of that, maybe?
So we classify it on the psychology side and nutrition side. So on the psychology side, they're what we call energy depleting psychologies. So ways of approaching ourself or the world which are burning up more resources than will be helpful. So an example would be what we call the achiever subtype. And these are people which are always pushing themselves and always driving themselves to do and to be more than they currently are. And if you imagine that someone's living in that way consistently, ongoingly, it becomes very depleting to the system.
So what you're saying is their resources insofar are finite,
right,
and they only last so long, and then resources start to diminish and they can't do the same thing anymore that they were doing and want to do.
And of course what most people do faced with a situation where they're used to pushing themselves and their resources start to diminish, they just push themselves harder because that's their almost default system. It's their way of approaching their life. Other examples on the psychology side would be the helper subtype. And these are people which are always kind of looking to help other people and put other people's needs as higher than their own. And if someone does that for long enough, after a while that becomes depleting. On the psychology side, we also refer to an anxiety subtype. And these are where people just have more of a sense of ongoing background worry and anxiety, and maybe, a situation that somebody else would be able to let go of more easily, but it kind of nags and it's kind of there and they're carrying it more. We also refer to a trauma subtype, and this may be where someone's got some kind of trauma in the past, which has never been properly released or kind of worked through. So if we look at these kind of subtypes on the psychology side, these are all things which place demands upon our system in ways that other people may not. Now, of course, there are people out there which have these subtypes that don't get ME. I mean, this is kind of one component. I
think if I track you there, that's one of the difficult things for people, because they're with their friends and they're not doing anything different from their friends, and they're getting sick and the friends are okay.
Yeah, and we'll come to in a little bit of how we have these predisposing factors, but we still require triggers and things to cause ME or chronic fatigue to manifest. But before we come to that, also we refer to certain subtypes on nutrition or the more physical side of it. So we talk about an immune subtype. This is where people maybe right from being very young, they were more likely to catch colds and viruses, and they just seem to be getting sick a lot. So there's a weakness within the immune system.
Okay.
We also talk about a detox subtype. And this is where people just seem to, ongoingly through their life, have had issues around toxicity, being it they've been overly exposed to chemicals or organophosphates and those kind of things. And maybe they've got a lot more food intolerances, but you can kind of see that they have trouble with kind of detoxing, substances that other people maybe would be okay with. And then just the final of these 7 subtypes as we classify them, and different clinics have obviously different ways of doing that, is what we call the diet and lifestyle type. And this is where people, and it's something that's becoming obviously more and more prevalent in the Western world, is people that just don't look after themselves. Lots of drinking, smoking, partying, not resting, and living life in a way which is placing too many demands. Shift work is a great example of that. People which are up 5-6 nights a week working, and they're constantly pulling their body out of its natural balances and ways of being. So you have either one or a few or a collection of these predisposing factors, these subtypes which are there. But as you mentioned, lots of people in society can have those things going on, without it necessarily manifesting as something like chronic fatigue, ME, that kind of group of illnesses. A couple of things about that. Firstly, it's obviously a lot of these ideas are kind of embryonic in that they're based on clinical experience rather than kind of ongoing kind of scientific research. But we believe there's a genetic component which may well be going on. So why does one person have all of these predisposing factors and develop ME and someone else develops maybe cancer or heart disease or something else? There's maybe a genetic component that's there. But in a high percentage of cases, there's normally a trigger event of something that happens that with all of these predisposing factors weakening the system, something that happens that kind of pushes them in to some kind of burnout. That could be anything from a very stressful life event, like the loss of a job or loss of a loved one or a divorce or something like that, to being exposed to some kind of virus. Glandular fever is often one that many people have. There are also people which have what we call gradual onset, where it's the predisposing factors but so much out of balance over so much time that the body simply cannot keep going. I think a really helpful way to look at it is chronic fatigue, ME, whatever we kind of choose to call that really it's an example of the demands being placed upon the system being more than the system can handle for long enough that something kind of snaps.
Yeah, you see, the more you talk about it, the more I realise this is a lot of information.
Yeah.
And for somebody who doesn't know about health and just wants to live their life, especially a young person, this is quite daunting, that I've got to be aware of this. I've got to make sure that I don't overstress myself, doing this particular sport I want to do or studying for examinations, and my social life's in balance. I don't have too much binge drinking, all the rest of it. And that's a lot for a young person to take on board.
And, as I was saying, it's where the demands placed upon the system for long enough that it's like a fuse goes or something kind of snaps in the system. And, to give you some statistics, for example, it's believed there are around 250,000 people in the UK which are affected with ME severe enough that it's been diagnosed. My sense is it's probably a lot higher than that. They're quite old statistics, and I think a lot of that is because people just aren't being diagnosed because doctors...
And most people are tired.
Right.
Most people are saying, I get tired.
In fact, it's an interesting point, because if you think about it as being kind of a line where you've got at one end people that are just a bit more tired than that maybe they used to be, and people which are severely kind of housebound or bedbound with ME as an illness, you see that as you say, most people don't have as much energy as they might have. But also most people live their lives in a way which is a lot of stresses on us these days in the Western world. And it's very, the human body adjusts quite slowly genetically over time to become used to the environment we're in. And if we look at the changes in fact, even from the point that I got ME back in 95, or 96, that since then, mobile phones, the internet, that, you're out for a walk relaxing and your phone's ringing the whole time. It wasn't like that even 15, 20 years ago. So a lot has changed in our environment, and ME is an example of it being too much for people to handle. And a useful analogy that people have used is it's a bit like down in the mines. They would take a canary down because a canary would get affected by kind of pollution and that kind of thing more quickly than anybody else would.
It was the gas.
The gas, right, exactly. The gas. So they were kind of the warning. One of the ways to look at it is maybe people there are like the canaries. They're kind of the warnings that the way that we're living for a lot of people is placing too many demands.
I read about this the other day. It's funny you should mention that. And I read what happened originally was the canary would go unconscious, but they didn't let the canary die. They would take the canary out. They would all leave straight away.
Yeah.
And so they'd catch it at the point even before the canary died. Now, that's intelligence.
That's not what generally happens
absolutely
in the Western world.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned before as well, what often happens is as people start to get ill, they often will continue to do the things which cause them to get ill in the first place. We've, as a clinic, treated well in excess of 2,000 people. So I've been responsible for seeing a lot of different ME cases. And you'd be amazed by the number of people that will say things like, I started to develop symptoms and I was really struggling to get through the day at work. And I thought that I was just unfit, or I thought I was just being lazy. So I went and joined the gym.
Which probably isn't a very good idea.
Well,
is it?
it's statistically with ME, one of the things that's been found is early diagnosis is a strong indicator of a good prognosis going onwards, because it means we're stopped doing the things which are constantly weakening and damaging the system.
Yeah, but we also have to listen.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to go along with the advice, which isn't always easy, because you get a bit down, and then you energy-wise, and then you kind of adjust things a little bit, and you feel a bit better, and you start really trying to race back to where you were. It's very hard, that mental discipline.
It is, and there's so much conflicting advice as well. Again, a lot of people that we've been responsible for treating, when they first got ill, went to their doctor and were told, "Oh, you're just depressed," or what are you complaining about? And so our culture we live in kind of supports ignoring how we feel to keep up with the status quo and what we're used to doing. And a kind of a key lesson for a lot of people in their recovery is actually that stopping trying to kind of hold on to their life and actually an acceptance of what's happening. And when I say acceptance, I don't mean giving in and saying, this is my life, I'm never going to get better from this, but actually creating an environment which is going to be supportive to recovery. That can involve some very difficult life decisions sometimes.
Yeah, and is everybody equipped to do that?
Wow. And it's, as we also we mentioned, there's so much conflicting advice, and if you have an illness, if you have an injury, like you break your arm or you break your leg, and people can see that, and if you can't walk because you've broken your leg and it's in a plaster, you go into work and people will offer to help you, and it's a very visible thing. With ME, it's treated with a lot of skepticism by most people. People will say, I've got chronic fatigue or ME, and people often say to them, well, I think I've got that. Well, I'm tired all the time. And they don't quite understand that there's a difference between someone that can't get through a day without having to go to bed, and the fact that, obviously many people do have a certain amount of fatigue. So people are met with so much skepticism and so much lack of understanding in the world around them that in that environment it's very difficult for people to be accepting of themselves of what's happening. When I got ill when I was kind of 15, 16, up until that point I'd been very into sport, very active, and I defined myself a lot by being that way. And struggling to keep going at school and not able to do PE lessons, physical education. So I would have to go home and rest, where all my friends would go and play football. Very difficult to explain to people. Yeah,
and also psychologically you have to take that on board for yourself, and that is not easy.
Yeah. In fact, that brings us to, we talked about predisposing factors and triggers, that there's a whole other section which is often very key with ME, which is the perpetuating factors. We don't get too complex here, and there's lots of different kind of parts to look at that. But just a couple of components I think are really important. One of which is, if there's been stress prior to being ill, when somebody gets ill, there's a massive new stress. And that's the stress of being ill. With an illness where no one can really tell you what's wrong with you, or certainly few people can, people are often questioning, thinking you're being lazy and kind of get on with it. And often if life was stressful before, you've still got all the same demands, but you've got no capacity to meet those demands. That's incredibly stressful for people to deal with. And then you've got the repeating questions aside of the mind of, what's wrong with me, and why is it wrong with me, and will I ever get better, and what should I do? Should I rest? Should I push myself? And all this stuff's going on in the background. And of course that drives up the nervous system. And when the nervous system drives up in that way, we're in exactly the opposite state to what we need to be able to recover and heal. to put it in the simplest terms possible, your body can either be in a stress state or it can be in a healing state. And if you're in a stress state, you're using more energy than you're building. When I say build energy, through eating food and rest and those kinds of things, if you're in a healing state, you're building more energy than you're using. So in the simplest terms possible, recovery from ME requires being primarily in a state of healing. But if we're dealing with this mysterious illness and no one can explain it and what's wrong and, I've got paying the bills and I've got a family to support and all those stresses and anxieties, it causes people to go into what we refer to as a maladaptive stress response. So their ability to handle and tolerate stress is now nothing like what it would be in a normal person.
But you see, what is a healing state practically? How does one live in a healing state? That's a question I'm asking.
No, absolutely. And it sounds like a simple question, but there's a lot to it. I think the first thing is there needs to be a place of acceptance. And there needs to be enough support in the environment that somebody is able to properly take rest. So
if somebody has a job and children to look after and the general things one has in life, then what you're saying is there's almost a question of discipline, saying, I have to take time during the day just to be quiet. Is this what we're talking about?
Yeah, and obviously it greatly depends upon how severely ill somebody is. If someone's in a category where they can just about keep going with their life, it may be enough to take time each afternoon, for example, to rest. If someone is very severely affected, it may be a lot more drastic than that. Certainly, we found that people who can create a supportive environment and come to a place of acceptance and start to treat the underlying physical things that are going on, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit later, that certainly creates a much more supportive environment than somebody who is still kind of struggling to keep going with what's happening and doing the various treatments, but there's no real cultivating of an inner space to actually allow that to take effect.
See, what I'm getting from what you've said so far is that people have to somehow almost do their own assessment if they think they maybe have chronic fatigue or maybe at some level, whether if it's serious, well, they've already probably been to the doctor. But if they're just tired a lot of the time, which many people are, then they could take on board a lot of what you're saying.
Right.
They may not need to go to the doctor, but it could well be that some adjustments in their lifestyle is maybe going to prevent them from getting more seriously tired and maybe ending up with a diagnosis of ME. Yeah. And I'm just wondering what practical steps people can take on board from what you've said so far. Let's say the average, say, businessman or person at school, very active, housewife, doesn't matter what age they are, what should they actually do in terms of assessing their situation to see if they can make improvements?
I think it's a really good question. I think the first thing to say is that if there is more tiredness than should be there will be reasons. Yeah. So I think often what happens is people just go, oh, well, I'm just tired.
And you're saying that's not the natural state?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I mean, if someone thinks that tiredness is not being able to do a 100-hour week, then we've got something in their expectations to be looked at.
Yeah.
But, someone's doing a reasonably normal day-to-day life and they're feeling more tired than they should do, there'll be reasons. And you mentioned, and it's a very obvious thing, but it also makes a big difference, to actually listen to the body. So if somebody is at a certain time of day always feeling more tired, rather than just pushing through that, to actually listen to that. And they may even notice something as basic is they feel more tired after eating even a certain food, for example. It could be a very simple thing that's going on.
So the food can trigger an allergy?
Sure. I mean, back in the 90s, it was for a while seen as potentially the answer to ME. It's a small part of it, but it could be that someone's built up an intolerance to a food, and when they eat the food, their immune system thinks that something's invading them, and therefore they have a reaction to it. I'm a great believer in people taking proper rest. Proper rest doesn't normally mean coming home from work and crashing on a sofa and watching loads of mindless TV. It keeps the mind very active.
And drinking beer.
For anybody that doesn't believe that what we put in our mouth affects how we feel, then I encourage them to, try eating a load of chocolate for a day, and another day eat something, some really healthy food. There is a difference. And I think nutrition has got a bit of a bad reputation because of people's resistance to the idea of changing their habits of how they feel. But so really simple things like looking at all the things that people know a lot of this stuff. A lot of people know they should eat more fruit, more vegetables, all those kind of things. And of course, that in itself is not a curative treatment for ME. But in terms of managing life, decent rest, eating basically healthy food, and not necessarily becoming obsessive about it, and listening to our body.
So the starting point really is to say, so almost looking in the mirror in one way and say, look, Guy, this is not really working.
Yeah.
I'm heading maybe to a dangerous place.
Yeah.
I've got to take stock. I've got to see if I can stop using too much of my resources and try and find more balance in life. And then they have to try and make some adjustments if they can.
Yeah. Well, if you look at we can base what we do on one of two things. We can base it upon what our mind tells us and the environment tells us, or we can base it upon what our body tells us. Now, in day-to-day life, of course, we have responsibilities and things that we have to do. But if we spend nearly all of our life dictating what we're doing by our mind's conditioning if I want to do certain things and our environment, and we never listen to our body, after a while our body's going to start to shout. And if we ignore the shout, it's going to start to scream. And if we ignore the scream, then it's going to do something a lot more extreme, which is where often chronic fatigue and ME and those kind of things come into the equation. In every single case that I've come across, there have been a number of warning signs prior. But I think it can be very difficult in life when we kind of know what we should do, but we're so conditioned and drawn by all the things that are happening around us.
And life doesn't support us in that, because the other day I was getting some petrol for the car and I fancied a little snack, and so where you check out, there's these rows and rows and they're all basically unhealthy things packed full of sugar, which would give me a temporary lift, that's true, but doesn't actually solve the problem long term. There wasn't one thing that I regarded something healthy to eat. Yeah. And so you really have to go against the grain, and you've got on television with the advertising, you've got all these things, eat this, do this, and you'll feel better. But it's all temporary fixes.
It is. And, I remember when I was a teenager, I'd only eat 2 vegetables, which are peas and potatoes.
They're my favourite as well, actually.
And, I would sit there, if I had to, for 3 or 4 hours, refusing to eat something else that, that my family would suggest that might be better for me. That only changed when, after 6 months of struggling to get out of bed, I was desperate to do anything. It starts very young, and we get conditioned in these certain ways. And coming back to what we were saying about when people become ill and these kind of perpetuating factors like this stress response, it kind of relates to what we were saying about when we're kind of stressed all the time in our environment, and then you have something to really be stressed about, which is an illness like chronic fatigue or ME. After a while, the system starts to over-respond to things. We talked about food intolerances, and it's quite a good example. If you think pre-September the 11th or pre the London bombings, somebody could leave a bag on the underground, and people would kind of notice it, and it wouldn't be a particularly big drama, like people knew you're supposed to report, a bag lying around. Of course, after those events, people are at a much higher level of reaction to these things. And I remember being on the tube soon after the London bombings, and someone left a bag, and everyone just freaked out. Now, this is kind of what's happening in the immune system, for example, with food intolerances. The body starts to react to things that aren't actually dangerous because in a heightened state of alert. And at the real extreme with chronic fatigue and ME, we see this with the light and sound intolerances, that people are actually living in darkened rooms with masks on because they just can't tolerate any light. The system has got so out of balance that it's reacting to things that just aren't dangerous. And also, people that watch this may also start to notice that, these subtypes and trigger events and all these different things that I'm talking about, this is complex. It really...
It sounds it to me.
As we mentioned at the start, people are very used to having a specific thing for a specific pill to then get better. And with all these different things that are going on, it takes... I remember you once used the term, it's like being a detective. And people have to take that approach. But there are answers. The fatigue that most people with chronic fatigue and ME experience, there has to be, and there are, biochemical reasons why that's happening. And without going into too much biochemistry, because it's not my area of expertise, that there's the production of energy on a cellular level. And if the body is not reproducing energy efficiently, of course, we're going to start feeling fatigue. And this also explains people that are watching this that do have ME or know people with ME, quite a difficult symptom to understand until you see it in this way, is the delayed fatigue people will experience. So somebody can be doing a certain thing and they're aware they're kind of pushing it, but they're kind of okay. And then it hits them 2 days afterwards. And suddenly 2 days afterwards, it's like somebody's just taken the plug out of that, and the energy just disappears. And this is because the body is not recycling ATP efficiently, ATP being the raw ingredient of energy. And when they crash, it then takes a while for the body to then rebuild that cycle. And what this shows us is that there are physical explanations of the symptoms that are going on. The trouble is that it's different things at different people in different ways, and that's what makes it so complex.
Yeah, and as you were saying earlier, there's also psychological input that's causing those physical reasons as well. Yeah,
to kind of try and simplify a little bit of all this information that we've been talking about, you've got the predisposing factors. So you've got your things that are going on prior to developing ME, and if you just had those, you may well never develop ME or chronic fatigue anyway. What you might have, though, is a bit more fatigue than most people. We certainly talked about that. It might be that someone is always placing other people's needs first, like with the helper subtype. And they do that long enough that after a while, their body's getting more and more diminished. And at that point, if their way of being in the world is to help others, often they'll start to help others more because that's what they're used to doing.
Yeah, so what a helper needs to do is not only help other people, but also to help themselves sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, the intellectual answer to that is that to help others, you have to have the resources to do it.
Yes.
But that's a very difficult thing for someone to learn to live in their life. So we've got these predisposing factors, and then for a percentage of people, there's some kind of trigger event that happens, and we talked about things like a vaccination or a big event in their life, and that causes the system to crash. But then you've got these perpetuating factors that we've also been talking about, and one of these being this maladaptive stress response. We've got this whole new stress and anxiety of being ill and struggling to get through the day, and trying to explain to people what's happening and thinking, there's all these different ideas of what I should be doing. Should I be resting? Should I be pushing myself through it? I've been put on this special diet and I can't get the food. All this stuff that can start to go on. And also at this point, it's like the system crashes. And when it crashes, it's like there's just nothing left to reboot it. And it requires energy to heal. So if we're stuck in this stress state, there's no resources to start to heal and repair the damage of what's been going on. In terms of what we do about it, we've obviously talked about it.
Well, I was also interested in kind of how you dealt with this in your situation. I know some of it's in your book, but how did you deal with all this?
Initially not very well, but after several years of just being completely lost, completely overwhelmed and struggling to kind of keep going with my life, I realised that if things were going to change, then I would have to do something to change them. And spent 5 years for myself, consistently and at times obsessively, researching health, psychology, nutrition, meditation, anything that I thought could make a difference.
So you had to build your own picture of where you had to work out where you were. Didn't necessarily have the answers how to change that. You had to work that out through doing a lot of research.
Yeah. Things that...
But you were motivated because you desperately wanted to get well.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes the starting point. We don't want to be desperate. When we're desperate, we're more willing to do something about the situation.
There's a huge amount of power that comes from desperation. And it's not just in ME, we see it in all areas of life. But with that, effectively the way that I saw it, which in hindsight was quite black and white and maybe was part of the problem, was that my life wasn't worth living till I was well. Now, I'm not sure that was a particularly helpful way to look at it in some ways, because it meant that I was always stressed anytime I got a symptom. But it certainly drove a constant need to find answers. Things that took me 2, 3, 4 years to shift, these days with the huge advancement in treatments, both in the clinic that I run, but also other clinics around the world that are doing kind of similar kinds of work, that can change a lot more easily. After 5 years of studying and researching in those ways, and I think I saw 35, 40 different practitioners from all kinds of different areas. I think at one point I was taking 70 supplements a day.
Right.
And I was, doing all kinds of things like meditation, yoga to help with.
So it was trial and error to a large degree.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what you're saying now is that partly through what you've done, your own organisation, your own clinic, but also other people have done, there's a lot more actual practical information and analysis that people can find.
Yeah. What I see happening is lots of practitioners, clinics and experts seeing so many more people with ME and chronic fatigue these days that it's driving people to research and understand it more. What we do very well as a clinic is we look at what everyone's doing and try and pull it together in an integrative way which takes the best of different treatments. And as I said before, there are reasons why people are ill, and there are treatments that work to get people better. But even now, I'd be lying if I said to you that there's a magic answer that people come in and we do this and everyone actually gets better. There are some patients which are still challenging to work with. But certainly for us as a clinic, they're the ones we learn the most from. And that's where often new discoveries and new ideas come from. When you've got somebody where you've done the things which generally would make a difference and they haven't. And that's from a scientific approach, what throughout history has driven new discoveries. And it's a lot like being a detective, of trying to find out what is going on.
Is there ever a hopeless case?
There are cases which, they're less and less, but there are cases of people we've treated for 2 or 3 years, and we're still having to learn and find out what's going on. Yeah. The interesting thing is that most people that come to us have tried a lot of different treatments before that haven't worked. So most people come in thinking they're going to be the hopeless case. Yeah. And that's actually not true for the majority of people.
I think what I'm getting more and more from this is that, again, as we've covered this ground to some extent, that people want to go to someone and that someone provide the answer. You do this, you do that, take this, maybe do a little bit of meditation, take life a bit quieter, take these supplements, change your diet, everything's hunky-dory. But of course, that can work, that protocol, but the next person that comes in to see you might be a completely different protocol.
Yeah. And to be frank about it, it's not helped by practitioners, because the reality is practitioners' livelihoods is dependent upon having patients and treating them. Yeah. And, if you go to a butcher and you say, what shall I have for dinner tonight? They're going to sell you meat. If you go to a vegetarian cafe, they're going to sell you vegetables. Yeah. Practitioners generally see the world through their model of how they see it. And therefore, if you go to a certain practitioner for certain therapy, they'll see it through their model, and they'll gather lots of information that their model is the model, because that's how they're seeing it. What we try to do is look at all the different models and try and pull the best together. And the Optimum Health Clinic's been going 5 years. It's treated several thousand people in over 20, 25 countries. But it's still very new in terms of developing these ideas, and it's very exciting. But it's also it's a big project to understand.
Yeah. So, what's the starting point? I've asked you this before. The starting point, now we've heard all this, is someone has to make a decision. Are they going to try and sort this out on their own? If you try and sort it out on your own, that's a tall order, but it's maybe possible. You kind of did it. Yeah. Or you have to find someone near where they live, or someone that they can work with who can try and treat their case as an individual case, a special case, and see if they can find through this information, this all the analysis you talked about, the different subtypes and the things that will perpetuate the disease, what's caused it in the first place, to see if they can find a clear way of moving forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think it's both. There needs to be personal responsibility that's there. So when we treat people, it's not that they give all responsibility to us and it's our job to fix it. I think people always have to be their own kind of practitioner to a point, but what they also want to do is to work with people which are experts, not just a local nutritionist who's seen 2 or 3 people in a lifetime. There are clinics like ours that we treat on average about 60 people a week with ME. There's a lot more obviously knowledge that comes from that. One of the other real benefits of it's a benefit of what is also the problem with modern society, things like the internet and the developments in those kinds of things, that we have patients all over the world because we can work with them using local laboratories to where they are, and by doing things by telephone. There's a heck of a lot more information available now than there was before. And I think it's really important that people understand that ME can feel incredibly isolating, and it can feel like it's never possible to get better or to change it. And there are many, many people that have had ME and got better. It's different for everyone, and it requires people to find their own path through it. And there are also many inspirational stories of people which have had ME and got better, and it's really helpful for people to have access to those kinds of stories. Our philosophy as a clinic is, again, like other people out there, is to provide as much information as for people that's freely available to help them find out if it's going to be a fruitful way of them working on their own situation. Information is really key for people to understand.
So if you were to just summarise, what are the main precursors for getting ME, chronic fatigue? What are the main causes as you see them? From
our model of it, and as I say, everyone has, different clinics have different perceptions, but our model is, it's effectively a process of burnout. So anything which causes the system to ongoingly not be able to handle the demands placed upon it is a factor in causing ME. So it can be psychological traits, it can be physical traits, it can be environmental things, it can be lifestyle things. Any of these things together. In fact, just briefly, a very useful analogy is to think about a boat with different loads on it. And when you get to the point you have too many loads for the boat to be able to handle it, and it starts to sink, that's really what's often going on with ME and chronic fatigue. Then you have a whole new load on this boat, which is the stress of being ill. So that's a kind of a useful way of looking at it. It's just too many things that are going on together.
And the way society is going is the boat's going to get more and more loaded up, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, without getting too kind of political here, one way of looking at it is the economy, the environment are getting their version of ME. They've been out of balance for so long that the demands placed upon them, it's not sustainable. There has to be a readjustment. And that's one way of also looking at it, that it's a readjustment period. And ME used in the right way can actually be life-changing in a very positive way, that people actually make changes that actually make their life a lot richer. It doesn't feel like that at the time, I know, but It absolutely can also be that way.
But isn't the planet getting ME as well? And this is not a joke.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Have finite resources.
That's what I mean by the environment, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
at every level, the banking system's got ME, the environment's got ME.
Absolutely. And you said it yourself earlier, the question is how quickly do we listen to that?
Yeah. So it's really very much a question of listening to the messages outside, listening to the messages inside, putting it all together, and living a life that's this word that we all use these days, a sustainable life.
Right. Which is not always easy when there's all these different demands that are on us. But if we're able to find a way to do that, then ultimately a life recovered from ME is often in my experience, people that recover, is a happier life than life prior to ME.
So you see the ME situation that you were in now was very difficult at the time. You see it as a positive experience now. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone on since my recovery to develop the clinic, and that's been personally incredibly rewarding to be able to help other people in a similar situation, but also in terms of a certain amount of self-insight and ability to kind of listen to myself and enjoy my own process through life. You know, I didn't have a particularly easy childhood in some ways, and I was conditioned to approach life in certain ways. And it's not really in life until we're forced to really look at that we actually make changes around that. And, you know, with people that we've treated as a clinic, it's often extraordinary the changes that come out on the other side that people discover after being ill for, you know, 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 25 years sometimes. The things that seemed important before often don't seem so important afterwards. And often there are dreams or things people want to do in life that they never quite get round to doing. And ME really forces us to look at that. You know, what do we really value in our lives?
So it changes your perspective in a way,
Yeah.
or encourages you to change your perspective.
Absolutely. You know, and if people recover without making those deeper changes, often what can happen is there's a need for that wake-up call to take them back to living life in a more balanced way.
So they can recover and they can crash again in 2 years'
If
time.
If the underlying lessons and things aren't changed,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah. It's a deep process, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, another way of looking at it is that I think we spend a lot of time in life wanting things to be different to how they are. And there's something about something like ME where if someone can learn to accept the path and the process that they're on. You know, we were doing a workshop recently for ME patients. People were saying, I just want to get back to full-time work. And I remember saying to them, you know, full-time work is overrated sometimes. You know, I obviously don't miss having ME, but there was something about having that time to really understand myself and to have that process and that journey, that if people can be more kind of in accepting and embracing of where they are, then that's also a very important life lesson. You know, we're always so focused on the destination of where we want to go and think we should be, that if there's a place of finding happiness and joy on the journey of recovery, it's a very valuable lesson to have when we're recovered, because the challenges in life don't end when someone recovers from ME.
No, I understand. It's ongoing.
You know, those lessons can be really valuable life lessons.
Okay, we have to wind up now, Alex. I'd just like to thank you very much for coming along, to remind our viewers that Alex has written a book about his story, how he recovered from ME, why me, and he also has this report that's available from his clinic, and the website address will be in the programme, ME in the 20th Century. And I like the subtitle, You Are No Longer a Mystery. That's a good point to end on. Thank you for watching Conscious TV. Goodbye.